Good morning or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm moderating the second YouTube panel session in our third annual Fathers for Pixels live stream series. So through the Fathers for Pixels YouTube panel sessions, the Pixel Project is providing a platform and learning resource for fathers across the world to step up to speak out about the importance of combating violence against women, sexism, and misogyny. So this June's Fathers for Pixels campaign features dads from India and the USA. Each live stream YouTube session will feature 2 to 3 panelists discussing a topic that links fatherhood and how dads can help stop violence against women in their families, communities, and cultures. And each session will also include a live moderated Q&A session for dads and communities to ask questions. So our topic today is My Book Dad, Fatherhood and Male Role Models in Speculative Fiction. And here to take part in today's discussion panel are 3 Read for Pixels authors who are also dads. So the first one is Errick Nunnally. He's right below me on the screen. And Errick was raised in Boston, served in the U.S. Marine Corps. Is it the U.S. Marine Corps? Marines Corps? Yep. Graduated from art school and studied Krav Maga. He has published 3 novels, Blood for the Sun, All the Dead Men, and Lightning Wears the Red Cape, and several stories in anthologies and magazines. Marshall Ryan Maresca, who is to my right, is a fantasy and science fiction writer, author of the Meridian Saga, 4 braided series set amid the bustling streets and crime-ridden districts of the exotic city called Meridian, which includes The Thorn of Denton Hill, A Murder of Mages, The Hover Alley Crew, and The Way of the Shield, as well as the diesel punk fantasy, The Velocity of Revolution, which is a really cool title, by the way. And he is also the co-host of the Hugo-nominated Stabby Award-winning podcast, World Building for Masochists. And Paul Tremblay, who's right below Marshall, has won the Bram Stoker, British Fantasy, and Massachusetts Book Awards, and is the author of The Pallbearers Club, Survivor's Song, The Cabin at the End of the World, A Head Full of Ghosts, and other novels and collections. His essays and short fiction have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, and numerous year's best anthologies. And for you, the audience, you'll also be able to ask them questions live. So just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the screen. And Anusha, who's today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to our panel to answer. And so let's get started with a quick intro to what we're going to discuss today. So speculative fiction, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror, has long been cracked with stories that include themes revolving around fatherhood. Indeed, speculative fiction across genres have created and peopled their stories with a wide range of fictional fathers and father figures. These include the genuinely wonderful dads like Jonathan Kent, the adoptive father of Clark Kent, also known as Superman, and single dad Captain Ben Sisko in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, all the way to the twisted and violent versions of fatherhood embodied by Jack Torrance in The Shining, which Paul should know all about since Paul's a horror author here, and Darth Vader in Star Wars, who we can also see in the latest Obi-Wan Kenobi series, if you're all tuned into that. And it's so iconic, and these fictional dads are so iconic that they have made their way into mainstream pop culture consciousness. So today, in acknowledgement of the power of stories and storytelling in creating and presenting powerful and influential fictional paternal role models, this panel will be talking about fatherhood in fantasy, science fiction, and horror, how positive male role models in genre fiction can help address sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in pop culture. We'll also touch on tips and suggestions for writing better fictional dads. And so with all this in mind, let's get the discussion rolling. Welcome, Errick, Marshall, and Paul. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for having us.
let's get started with the first and most obvious question. It's Father's Day weekend right now, so we have to ask, what is the best thing about being a dad? So let's go clockwise. So let's start with Marshall.
That's about being a dad. Questions like that I find so hard to articulate the best answer because it is a thing that changes so much over the course of time in being a father. Because the great things about being a dad when your kid is 3 to 5 is completely different than when your kid is 10 to 13, and completely different to when your child is an adult now living on their own, which is the stage I'm in now. And in speaking for the stage I'm in now, with my son has his own apartment and is living pretty much independently, and for me, it's just I just take I take a lot of pride in the fact that he is doing that and doing that well, doing it better than I did at that age. And so, I mean, you get this small sense of, hey, maybe I did something right over the course if he's turned out okay like that. So that's it for me at this point.
Paul?
I guess a very similar answer. I mean, I think being a parent is like the quick way of saying it. To me, it's like the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also the best thing I've ever done. And it certainly has changed as my kids are older. I mean, if you would ask me 10 to 15 years ago, I probably would have said my favorite thing would be like these just, unvarnished, love-filled hugs, like of a kid just wrapping himself or herself around your neck, and just that unabashed, like, oh, I'm this human's parent, and like there's all that responsibility, but like it just sort of any fears and anxiety sort of melt away with that kind of hug. But now that my kids are older, one's in college and one's about to go to college, it's a totally different feeling, but it's just so amazing to see them be, excellent humans, also able to stand up for themselves, but also stand up for other people. And it's like, man, how do they, I give all the, the credit to my partner, wife, Lisa, but it is just really cool to see them be like really good people and still like, don't want to put too much pressure on them that they have to be perfect. I mean, I think that's another sort of, I guess the different side of parenthood now that I'm getting older is like, you don't want them to think like, that they can't make a mistake, because you do want them to come talk to you about stuff like that. So I don't know. It's always complicated. I don't know. And even as an educator too, I don't know how everyone else is, but it's hard not to think about like all the times where you feel like you screwed up and try to not remember those all the time. Just remember the parts that, that you do want to celebrate this weekend in particular.
Yeah. Errick?
I wouldn't, of course, disagree with anything else that was said, but I think bringing joy to these little people that we're responsible for, and even when they're bigger people, being able to do that for them. But it's also really satisfying, and almost all of this is emotional, but the sort of the data part is being able to actually measure a certain amount of progress. And I think it's very human to find satisfaction or joy in some kind of progress. What you can measure is progress, and seeing them, like I don't want to just say be better than me, but actually learn from things that my wife and I have tried to get them to understand, and watching them apply it, and and be better than we did at the same time is fantastic.
Y'all are more introspective as dads than my dad, who was from the boomer generation, and he used to say that after his kids have grown, that as long as I don't get a call from the police, the hospital, or the fire department, we are all good. Seriously, I think a lot of boomer dads are like that. Like, don't hear anything, they're not in trouble, all is good. Nobody's dead, everyone's fine, so relatively. So yeah. So let's
I was going to say, just to be fair to your dad, that's a good baseline, though. I mean, we can go beyond that, but that's a good baseline.
Yeah, I think we're going to touch on the reason why that is along the way. So
yeah.
Okay, so so let's get started with talking about fathers, fatherhood, and male role models in speculative fiction. So in the introduction to this panel, we mentioned a few of the best known dads across speculative fiction and pop culture who also represent both ends of the fatherhood spectrum, you know, from dads who make great male role models to fathers who embody toxic masculinity and violence. So, who are your favorite fictional fathers in speculative fiction and why? So, let's start, Errick.
You know, the first thing that pops into my head is a character named David Silver from Alien Blues by Lynn Hightower. And it's a series of 4 or 5 books. I don't remember how many there are, but he's a police officer, and there has been a number of refugee aliens that have become part of society. So far it sounds like alienation. But this I believe this was written or in existence before the movie was made or something like that. And he's married to a woman that is in so many ways more dangerous than he is, but she's somewhat retired, and they I think they have 2 daughters. And I just always remember his character being somewhat average. Like, for a main character, he's he's kind of very average, but he has a really good relationship with his wife and his daughters. And I remember him being very attentive, and you know, there was a certain amount of nuance and a lack of wounded pride in his wife's capabilities, and also being proud of his children's capabilities. You know, they're raising these 2 kids, and they're very confident, and they're very young in the series. And the other one is Mookie Pearl from the Blue Blazes and the Hell's Blood Bride by Chuck Wendig. And you can see this is one of these sort of a broken father who did not parent well to begin with, but over time understands what he didn't do well and tries to rectify it. And in the end of these 2 books, he makes a decision that made absolutely perfect sense to me as a father, but I don't know necessarily that anybody reading this would be satisfied with the ending, but it made perfect sense to me. I'm not going to give anything away, but he makes a decision based on his daughter's actions that's may or may not be good for her, but is in her best interest, as he defines them as something that's not his best interests, if that makes sense.
Okay. Paul?
So, like, yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry, I unmuted myself for a second. Geez, you know, I went through and made like a list. Here it is.
The whole book.
Yeah, because it's funny. Like, coming from a horror background, like initially my first blush reaction is like, oh man, I don't know, because I read so much horror and so often, like, it's really almost a gothic. Well, not almost. It is a gothic fiction, gothic horror trope of sort of the evil father. But so I guess I wasn't a reader as a kid, but I'm going to choose one character. I think, now I realize why, part of the reason why I love that movie so much. So I'm cheating a little bit by talking about a movie first, but I'll talk about a few books too. But Chief Brody from Jaws, I mean, because that's, it's one of my favorite movies. I've watched it so often, and it's both scarred me and also inspired me for years and years. But in the comparison of him, I love the Chief Brody character, and I also love the Quint character. But, Quint is so charming, but he is sort of that, that testosterone filled, almost like typical male hero character, and because of that, he's really he dooms himself. He dooms the ship. Like, he just makes all these like hard-headed, tough guy sort of decisions that really lead the orca that in searching for the shark down the wrong path. But Chief Brody, if you watch the movie, he's practically egoless. Which is so unusual, I think, particularly for, fiction and films in the 70s. He's so egoless compared to the other characters, and a lot of ways selfless. Like, he's even willing to go on this boat, even though he's deathly afraid of water. He's trying to make the best decisions he can for the town, even though he's not sure of himself half the time. And I've always been drawn to that idea of, because it seems so realistic to me as much as Quint is fun, and I love that performance. You know, Chief Brody was always the realistic aspect of me. Oh, here's someone who isn't quite sure what the best thing to do is, but he's still doing the best he can. I want to mention a book that I haven't heard seen talked about in a while, even though it was a World Fantasy Award winner. I think it was 2006, 2007, but Steve Rasnick-Tem and Melanie Tem's The Man on the Ceiling. Is just this wonderful, warm, strange mix of memoir and fantasy novel. And Steve and Melanie had, adopted children. They had foster children. And this book, through a fantasy lens, sort of just deals with that struggle. And that book was one of the more moving experiences I've ever had, especially when I read it, because I read it as a young father. Just to see, again, sort of to tie it together with Chief Brody, sort of like, they're not always 100% sure what they're doing, but whatever, decisions they end up making, it always comes from like a place of love and from a place of trying to help some of these children, many of whom have suffered such traumas. So it doesn't always, work out completely well. But that's a book that I would definitely, that's the first one on my list that when I went back to look through, who are the parents in book form that I would want to sort of model myself after. And it ends up being, a couple of real parents, Steve and Melanie Tem.
I love that you mentioned Chief Brody, because I didn't even think of this, but at the time, like this is it's the 79, like it's
earlier, even 70.
I think it's like 76, 75, 76. Yeah.
Like it's okay. So, I mean, it's a while ago, but at that time, thinking back on it like that, the Brody characters would almost be considered a milksop, like at the beginning of the movie. He's kind of weak and formless. He's afraid of the water, and why is he on this island, etc., etc. And so that's one of the great aspects of the movie, that it shows that he doesn't have to be this hyper masculine, super tough guy to make a brave decision. Like, it's not about that. It wasn't about his masculinity so much as it was his actions that were the truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. Is that a perspective from a male perspective? Because when I watched it, I'm like, oh yeah, what he did just makes complete sense.
It does, yeah. And I would say it is a male perspective. Like, there's so much tied up in masculinity that's more demonstrative, that isn't quite real. That isn't about making decisions that are both good for us and good for the people that we love, or that we're responsiple for. So, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it definitely plays with, so like, the one person who knows like what's the truth a little bit. But again, like I love that he even shows fear, like before his wife does. Like, there's a great scene where he's telling his sons, get out of the boat, like, even though they're just sitting in it. And then later when she sees the picture of the shark, coming through the boat, like, I just like the idea, here's a, male let who's not afraid to let other people know that he's scared, that, he's vulnerable.
So Ryan, what's your favorite fictional dad? Who's your favorite fictional?
Yeah. In terms of books, I'm honestly a little bit stumped. I'm literally like looking over my bookshelves here and thinking how so many of the books that I read have like the absent dad trope, or the dead father trope, or something like that. That actual active fathers has been kind of a rarity in a lot of the genre books I've read. Now, moving on to movies and television, you mentioned Ben Sisko at the beginning of your list, and he's probably one of the best examples of a science fictional father on screen at all. I mean, he constantly is showing himself to be, putting his son first, but in interesting ways that allow his son to grow. I mean, some of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine are like, there's the one where he and his son build the sail ship, and his son like tells him the hard thing of like, this is what I want to go do with my life. And it's hard for him to accept this different version of his son than he had been expecting, but he does embrace it because he sees like the talent that his son has. And then of course the episode where he gets like stuck in time and we see his son grow to an old man, and then as an old man dies, and he's weeping on the ground of like, my boy, my beautiful boy. That got me hard when I first saw it in my 20s, and I watched it again recently, and it just destroys me because it's so moving and so raw and visceral in the emotion that he shows about his son.
So that when you mentioned active versus non-active dads in fiction, that ties in with a question from the audience. So Misty306, hi Misty. Misty is one of our longtime viewers. She follows all our Read for Pixels and Fathers for Pixels live streams. So Misty asks, in children's and YA literature, we're seeing more active and positive fathers. Which adult books do you see the same thing?
To build, actually, Errick mentioned Chuck Wendig earlier. I don't want to
Yeah.
necessarily make this a Chuck Wendig love fest. We give Chuck a huge ego, but I thought his Book of Accidents, which came out last summer, and there's a theme there. I mean, Chuck's been fairly open about like his, anyway, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but his relationship with his father is something he's explored in novels. That's definitely the case in Book of Accidents. And one of the main characters is a father who had a terrible father who may or may not be like a supernatural figure looming over a part of this novel, and it gets into sort of alternate universes where the main father character is sort of, he gets to see some of the branches he could have gone down, some of the terrible branches potentially. But the way Chuck handles it, I think, is really, really well done, really sort of authentic in dealing with the anxieties and fears of what it means to be a good dad, what it means to be a bad dad. And I think like he's able to, and he's able to sort of go towards, what does it mean to be a bad father? To me, that's where, even if like you see a father on the page presented in a sort of negative light, the hope is that the narrative within the context, lets the reader know that, hey, we're not, this is not behavior that we're rooting for. This is something that we're sort of being actively critical of, within the story. And I think Chuck does an amazing balance with that. So that's certainly that one. And I would also just really briefly mention Victor LaValle's The Changeling. Does an amazing job with this journey of of the dad named Apollo. And it takes it into sort of a fantasy realm where there's an act of violence towards a child, but it's done by the mother, but the mother might not be, she might have been sucked into fairyland. Like, again, like a form of it. Like, I don't want to give too much away. But again, like how he deals with the emotions are so authentic and so raw. And by the end of the book, it's so moving. To me, those are two very recent books that jump out.
Okay. Errick, any recommendations?
Well, this certainly, what I think has been interesting is seeing more gay couples and things like that in fiction. I mean, even one of us here may have written a novel featuring a gay couple, but I'll mention Hella, which is a science fiction novel by David Gerald, and it's about a colony, like an anchor colony on another planet, and the main character is both gender fluid and neurodivergent, which would be a challenge for even the most capable parent. And this is a single mom that's raising this kid. And the father figure is an officer. I'm trying to remember the specifics, but he's what's the word? An authority figure that's part of the colony that acts as his father figure, and they don't do everything right, which is great and perfectly normal, but there's no malice in intention. Like there's no one trying to force something on this very different kid, and they are also forced to understand how this person is growing, which is also great. Being able to acknowledge the emotional and growth of the child. So yeah, I find that to be a very positive aspect between both you know, this kid understanding the mother's relationship with this new person, and this new person being very responsible father figure with this very different child.
Marshall?
One that jumped into mind is in Fonda Lee's Greenbone saga. Really, over the course of the whole trilogy, you have the character of Hilo, who evolves from being like the young hothead in the family to then becoming a father figure to the whole family, and then explicitly becoming a father. And since the third book covers like a 25-year time span from being a father to young children to being father to an adult, and even though Hilo never loses that sort of angry hothead quality over the course of the series, it does become tempered with responsibility and the love he has for his children and other people that he's raising over the course of the book. And I think Fonda does a really good job of showing both the evolution and growth of that character as he matures into that role, but also just how important it is that he embraces that role.
So you mentioned earlier, and each of you have mentioned earlier about stereotypes, about dad stereotypes in speculative fiction. So, you know, there's everything from the pack leader to the absent patriarch to the domestic abuser, sadly, and the hypermasculine alpha male protector. So in your opinion, has the portrayal of fathers and fatherhood in horror, fantasy, and science fiction evolved beyond these stereotypes in the last 2 decades? And if so, how? And has the rate of progress or non-progress differed depending on the genre? So, for example, is fantasy behind horror? Is horror not moved at all? Is science fiction more progressive? Thoughts? Starting with, I guess, Paul.
Wow. Thanks. Geez, I mean, I would hope that in some ways, I still view first and foremost art, you know, if we're talking writing specifically, typically is usually more of a reflector of what's going on as opposed to something that's actually going to prod change. I mean, clearly there are books that do change people, but I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit pessimistic in that sense that, you know, there's been a lot of good books and it's still, you know, a lot of bad things happen in the world. I don't know, to just so blithely just throw that out as a blanket statement. But anyway, no, I do think horror in particular has come a long way. And I think horror had a well-earned reputation for being misogynistic, you know, racist and homophobic and, you know, all that, you know, particularly in the boom of the 80s, both in terms of books and film. You know, and I think, you know, now, you know, we're certainly seeing a lot more own voices, you know, publishing in horror and writing horror and making horror films as well. And we're seeing a lot more people willing to, I guess, accept horror too, which I think is a little bit important because now you get to see horror creeping into other genres. I think, you know, just having that like cross-pollination, that mix is going to make for, you know, better fiction. And for me, better fiction almost always means, you know, it's progressive in story structure, meaning that you're representing the fact in a horror story that there's some terrible event, but after that event, you know, everything's going to be different. Everything's going to be changed. I guess, so I'm just talking about horror in general, specifically to males or fathers. I mean, that's, again, I feel like that's hard to answer. I do think, you know, particularly now that we're seeing a lot more horror from women and people who aren't, you know, just, you know, cisgendered white male authors, you know, you're bound to see many more characters represented than just, I don't know, like the male superhero that Ash in Evil Dead sort of spoofs, right? I don't know. I mean, just, you know, how easily we were able to come up with examples, like current examples of fathers that are either presented in a positive light or you're able to sort of intuit that based on the context, you know, what makes them a positive role model. Wow, that was a really rambly answer. Probably not a very good one at all either. Errick, save me.
Well, you know, you're not wrong, but I will say that I think you mentioned one of the things you mentioned was that like a lot of bad things happen in the world, and I don't know what it is about human nature that makes us focus on that. maybe it's just a survival trait, like, right,
Mhm.
you know, you want to be aware of the bad things in order to avoid them, but you know, lots of good things happen in the world too.
Sure.
And I think one of the good things that have happened, you know, look at the current generation, Gen Z, like this is my daughter who's graduating, who has graduated. They are such a different group of people, and so weirdly diverse, and have such a wild set of both interests and influences, and you know, and even slightly older than them, that are producing content that makes sense to them, but it's pushing us all forward in a way, because if you want to stick around, you need to, you know, write with sort of a modern sense of things. But I do think that more male characters, right, and more characters that are in the fatherhood position are being presented with more nuance, more emotional nuance than before. But it's really hard to shake stereotypes. Like, you have to be very aware of what you're doing, or have a really good editor who points out that you're doing something, in order to sort of undo it or approach it from a different angle. And you know, I just think the fact that I keep bumping into I'm not even sure what the words are for this, because it's been so normal, heteronormative, to have a male, female, you know, parenting set, when there's so much more to be explored, and seeing more of that is, to me, is quite a leap of progress from, you know, the late 70s, early 80s,
Even like 10,
90s.
12 years ago.
Yeah, it wasn't
Yeah.
that long ago where you would not see this amount of diversity in terms of, yeah, both gender and ethnicity, and that, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to see. It's just, it hasn't quite penetrated the big leagues of publishing as much as it maybe could. We're seeing a lot more of that in more small press and independent, but it's happening, and frankly, it can't be avoided. It's just, you know, things change, and you can only hang on for so long, and those stereotypes are dying, however slowly, but they're dying.
Marshall?
Well, you made me think of a thing we were talking about on my podcast just a little while ago, where we were talking about the sort of presumptions people make on what relationship and family structures even look like. That, and we're seeing a lot more sort of challenging of those norms of, you know, does it have to be like, you know, does it have to be just a man or woman, or does it even have to just be a couple? Can what a parental structure even looks like in science fiction fantasy, can you make it into something completely different than what's, you know, what's expected? I feel like we're on the verge of some breakthroughs along those lines. That I can't think of a specific title off the top of my head that's recently come out that really pushes that sort of envelope, but I think we're going to see more and more where your fantasy or science fictional world building will present more and more a different set of norms as the norms of those worlds, and I think that's really exciting. I think just as you're saying, letting the heteronormative stereotypes just sort of wither away, and and coming up with new stuff, and I find that very exciting.
You know,
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, what are you saying, Errick?
Well, I as cool, as blatant as it is now, you know, I do think that there's a lot of science fiction that introduced a lot of these things, but very briefly, or very sort of, you know, kind of a castaway comment, where you find out that the character is say bisexual, or the character is an unexpected ethnicity, but it's just mentioned like once, you know,
Right.
very briefly, and then off we
Blink
go.
and you miss it.
Yeah, you blink and you miss it, and people completely forget. Like, this happened with Harry Potter, like, recently, where, oh, that character's black, had no idea. And Plus, it's science fiction, so you're dealing with these, far future concepts, and it's like surprising how often these things were put into stories, but we never quite got it because it wasn't blatant. So
Right.
it's cool that it's been around as long as it has, that people have been not necessarily accepting of it, but authors have been introducing these concepts, and that now it's become a little more core to the conception of things. Plus, the idea of it's also interesting how palatable a lot of this stuff becomes in like alien ecologies. If you create a race that doesn't actually have a male, and maybe there's three that are part of a
Right.
family unit or something like that, or the culture insists that you have a broad group of people raising the young, so stuff like that. It's wild that all of that has existed, but now it's become more central, I think, to the storytelling, which is super cool and progress.
Yeah,
Well, I think at least part of that, I think at least part of that is like on an editorial level, when writers were writing that 10, 15, 20 years ago, probably the editors or publishers are going, can you dial that down a little? Can you make it nearly scrubbed out? Because that would make us all more comfortable. I think now they're a lot more willing to have that be part of the book. I mean, not to self promote, but my book, The Velocity of Revolution, where the culture that I show in there is one where pansexuality and polyamorism is the norm of the culture. I don't think that book could have gotten published 5-10 years ago.
Right.
Like it wouldn't, like nobody would have even touched it. And
Yeah.
but now I can do that and not be, have that attacked or have that scrubbed or have it get thrown in the bin.
Right. Yeah, I think it's the Forever War by Joe Alderman, where faster than light drive in war creates kind of a perpetual war situation. However, the people that are fighting this war are kind of skipping forward through time because they're in
Right.
FTL for 20, 30 years, and they pop out, and this happens over centuries. And at one point they come out and the entire Earth is gay. Like the whole Earth is single gender gay, and they're producing children in a very different way, and then they continue to skip forward. So it was a blink and you miss it. It was very jarring because it was such a shift, but there it was, and Alderman wrote that decades ago.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm just gonna point out that Star Trek can also be the barometer of how fathers are portrayed, because we started with Captain Kirk, because the captains are like the parent figures on the ship, right?
Terrible.
So we started with Captain Kirk and we landed up with Captain Pike right now in Strange New Worlds. And let me tell you, everyone loves Captain Pike. Like, we love Ben Sisko and we love Captain Pike because look, functional leadership
Yeah.
and parenting, so father figure sort of stuff when you need it.
Captain Pike is, while not sexually a father, is such a good dad of the whole ship. Like it's clear that's what he's doing in his portrayal, and I love it. I love it so much.
And look at the hair on that guy. You can tell he's in charge.
Yeah. So before we move on to talking about writing, I've got one more question in this section, which is, a lot of dads now, who are dads of young kids now, kids who are growing up, they've grown up reading science fiction, fantasy, and horror, as well as being very well versed with pop culture. And do you think that positive father figures in speculative fiction can provide influential and positive male role models for dads that can counteract ideas of toxic fatherhood? Anyone? Paul? Errick?
Errick raised his hand first.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I my answer to that is maybe. And I only say maybe because I've met people who are strongly influenced by a character or story and got to know the author, and it turned out the author became an influence as well, right? So you've got a very fictional character, right? I think it's important for people to remember that these characters are created almost from whole cloth. They might be based on real people, but you know, they're doing exactly what the author wants. And oh, thank God they meet or research and get to know the author somehow, and they're not a monster. You know, never meet your heroes, that thing, but sometimes when you meet your heroes, they really are heroes. And that's been a good thing. So I think it's possible. So it's kind of a big maybe that, you know, you present something that deeply interests somebody, and then they connect in reality with something that does prove even more influential.
I guess it's like you guys. And Joe Hill. We were talking about Joe and him being a dad.
Joe's a monster.
Yeah. I mean, look at it this way. Three of you write some of the most, vibrant characters in speculative fiction, including some dysfunctional fathers. And, people who meet y'all are going, hey, wait, these actually really, good people. And they're not violent. They're, they're talking sense. They accept, they're very accepting and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think you're right, Errick. It's also, if you meet your heroes, hopefully they live up to it. So Paul was going to say something just now.
No, I love Errick's answer. I think I would add to basically what everyone here had said prior to that. Like, I think it's really difficult for a singular work to, to have like like an overarching lasting influence. But if it's a confluence of a bunch of, works that are we talking about coming out now, all, the different types of family representations that we're having. I mean, that accumulation of art is bound to have an effect, while also reflecting what's happening in the culture as well.
Mm-hmm. Marshall?
It struck me. Up a child,
Oh, Marshall, I think you're cutting out your sound.
Oh.
Yeah, you're cutting it out. Yeah.
Me. But now.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I think the phone was. No.
Sunspots or some other kind of interference. Yeah. Maybe he's going around the dark side of the moon. Who knows?
We can't hear you
hear
at
us.
all,
Usually it's my internet that cuts out. I'm just glad it wasn't me this time.
How about now? Okay.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know what went wrong there, but okay. That's I was saying, growing up, Gen X in America, I was, the number of times in media you're presented with the epitome of a bad dad is missing a baseball game or something like that. Even though for some reason your baseball game is like a Tuesday afternoon when there's a meeting, but you see that presented over and over again, that like the worst thing you can do is miss your child's event or something like that. You see, and then every one of those pieces of media, I mean, Hook is probably the biggest example. You see, like, what the lesson the father learned is, don't care about your work or anything else, just focus on your kids. You see that, happening over and over again. You certainly absorb that into your psyche. And so it certainly, I think, a lot of fathers of Gen Z now, because most of them are Gen X, are the kinds of who probably absorbs that message to a degree. And it's like, you know what, I am going to have more balance between work life and parental life, and presented that because of that media influence.
Okay. So let's talk about writing better father figures and male role models. So let's talk about the influence of fatherhood on writing fiction. So has being a dad had an influence on you as an author and on the way you choose to portray fathers and father figures in your stories? If so, how? So let's start with, I guess, Paul.
I mean, unquestionably, my son Cole was born in 2000. It was shortly after that I sold my first like professional rate story. I didn't really become serious about writing until after Cole was born. And, so many of the short stories and the novels I've written too are, feature children looking at their parents or parents looking back. So no, so many of my stories are about, the anxiety of parenthood and the anxiety of being a child too. So yeah, I mean, that's something, I work out in my fiction. My run of novels, starting with A Head Full of Ghosts, which is the one, if that sort of made my career such as it is. But A Head Full of Ghosts, and then Disappearance of Devil's Rock and The Cabinet at the End of the World. It wasn't a trilogy, but all three novels featured different kinds of families in distress from both interior and exterior forces. So A Head Full of Ghosts sort of features I don't say classically Gothic father. I think in some ways, he's trying to do the best he can, but he is trying to fulfill that sort of tropey, 80s, patriarch of the house, also with sort of the boogeyman of religion sort of trying to prop him up as well. Whereas Disappearance of Devil's Rock, the father's absent. And then The Cabinet at the End of the World is probably, is definitely the book that features the most positive, parental role models with Andrew and Errick. And I got to say, that was kind of nice writing some good dads for a change, because so much of it is I don't know, like, Errick asked the question, like, why do we always look at the bad things? And I can't answer that. I have no idea why. Like, I feel like I'm a pretty jovial person in person, but when I go to writing and when I go to reading, like, I'm just interested in sort of exploring the worst case scenarios, or when things go bad, how do people deal with it? So, there's certainly that aspect to it. So that's a long yes answer to having kids definitely changed my writing, and I'm sort of like in a weird place where I would say now that my kids are older, it's like, I can't write about, not I can't, but like, am I going to continue to write about teen? Like, I'm finding myself a little bit like, am I going to write like quote unquote empty nest stories? Like, I don't know. It's I feel like I'm at like this weird little crossroads in the next few years.
So speaking of empty nests, Marshall has an empty nest. So has your
this used to be my son's bedroom. Now it's my office.
Oh, well played, sir.
So has your writing, about the way you write about parents, about dads in your stories, has it changed? Before and after your son left. Like, is there like a before thing and an after thing? Because your son hasn't left for that many years, right? Like maybe a couple years.
Yeah, it's been about 2 years now.
Mm-hmm.
But not that I can think of. I mean, I tend to write a lot of like absent fathers that are thought of well. And like a lot of my main characters, their father is dead for one reason or another, but there is a lot of like fond thoughts about the father and how they were raised. I mean, I have in my Whole Valley Crew books, Asti and Verity, who are brothers, they're always talking about their father in a very positive way, even though he basically raised them both in a life of crime and taught them all the skills and tricks that they have for this life of crime. They still speak of him in a very loving manner of like, yeah, dad taught us it. Like he is a constant presence in the conversations they have, even though he's no longer around. And so that is the sort of thing I have a strong tendency to put in a lot of my characters. Just
Errick?
think of
it. Yeah, a very definitive yes, because I think one of the things that's gone on in my life is like there's one half of it where I was thinking one way and the other half where I was thinking another. And the kids, having children sort of accelerated that process as they went from like babies to people. Like, you have to you have to talk to them, and you have to reason with them, and realizing that children are more than anything a reflection of you. you know. So you see a lot of parents arguing with their kids or getting angry with them, and how they deal with that. And that's just recursive. Like, it just reflects onto the children, and that's how they learn to behave or how they learn to communicate. So that, plus realizing that there's an emotional nuance to, being a parent. Like, that's true for both, but it's usually the mother that's demonstrating the full spectrum of emotion. It's usually the father that's leaning somewhere into stoicism, and sort of confusing being attentive and present with being demonstrating the full spectrum of emotions. Like, when you're raised by a father who has never shown any vulnerability or emotional complexity, that I've learned that's not a great effect on your kids, because they don't learn to handle. They don't. First of all, they don't treat that particular parent as sort of fully human, in my estimation, and they. It's far too jarring or traumatic when they do demonstrate vulnerability or something like that. They don't learn to process it properly in both genders. Like men need to demonstrate the full spectrum of emotions in order to be, like real, fully formed people in the minds of their children. So yes, big time.
So on the flip side, has writing speculative fiction helped you to be a better dad?
No.
Does your answer dad?
The other thing I would say is, if it has the idea that, like, I'm proud of the fact that, like, even at school, like with my students, I'll sort of lump those into, just the idea that, like, oh, hey, here's someone who, despite like being a math teacher and a math major in college, like, oh, he's pursuing writing, and it doesn't, and not self-conscious about it. Like, the idea that it's okay to like things, it's okay to be passionate about things, which sounds almost like a little bit goofy to say, but like for teenagers especially, the whole idea of like how you're perceived, et cetera, what's your identity. I don't know, to me, I think that's an important thing that I have demonstrated for my children, and I think hopefully it is a little bit because of my example, but Lisa's as well, that the idea that it's okay to be passionate, whatever it is you're passionate about. And, we have two kids, who are drawn to the arts, but different kinds of arts. Like my son Cole is throwing himself into being a music production major, and my daughter Emma is very much like Errick, a graphic artist or a visual artist, not readers, but I've never made them feel guilty, maybe sometimes, for not reading, books or stuff like that. But so to me, I guess that would be the part that I feel like that has made me a better parent, is just to be. I feel like I learned that from my parents as well, though, too. I was fortunate in that sense that, hey, whatever you're interested in, that's okay. Like, it's okay to really, be passionate about something.
How about you, Marshall? Has writing fiction helped you to become a better parent?
Well, I mean, I would certainly agree with that in not necessarily like the act of writing, but being in a creative field and again showing that passion, showing that it is okay to still be super into things, especially when your child is in that sort of teenage phase and you're supposed to think nothing is cool, and you have to like put on a brave face about, it's like, no, I'm not into that. No, only babies are into that. No, nobody cool is into, like, if you're demonstrating as an adult that you're still into fantasy and science fiction and Marvel movies and all that, then they're going to be like, oh, okay, I don't have to let that go. I can stick with that. And so I think that sort of thing has been very helpful in letting him find his own voice and grow the way he needs to grow.
Yeah. So basically not, smashing the prescribed path, because lately people have been talking about these milestones that, exennials, millennials, and Gen Z don't seem to be, minding, like, your first getting married, having kids, having your first house, having your mortgage, having a pension. It's all smashed to bits now.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it is.
It's not going to happen for many people. Not all of it, or not in the same order in which it happened for.
Certainly not on the timeline that it was expected for us.
Yeah.
No
So,
kidding. What both Paul and Marshall said, like, my initial thought was no, but clearly that's really not true. But here's two things happening, right? So someone offered a thought that sort of changed my perspective slightly, like, just remembering that all questions and answers are multifaceted and can be looked at in different ways and understood in different manners. But I hadn't considered that doing this has created like another channel in a relationship with my kids, because it's not a secret. It's not something I hide from them. It's exactly what you guys were talking about with having a passion or an interest in something that maybe they're not terribly interested in, or maybe their friends are, or so there's just these other ways of having other conversations with your kids based on your interests, so that they're aware of them and that they take the right lesson from it, which is exactly what I think you all are saying. Like, it's okay to have interests that maybe not many people are all that terribly interested in doing, and to push them in those things, because both of my girls do things that I had never considered, or I wish that I had done, or they're just so different from the things that I did when I was growing up. And I hope that doing this stuff helped contribute to that. So yes.
So let's talk about the nuts and bolts of how to write better and more powerful representations of fathers and fatherhood in speculative fiction. So first of all, and a natural segue from what we were all talking about is, what would you advise to authors who are not fathers or parents themselves, who wish to create and write compelling, nuanced, and positive fictional dads? Let's start with Marshall. What's your one piece of advice to them if you don't have this life experience as a parent?
Show your father characters engaging with their children in tactile ways, like actively picking up babies, actively, helping children get dressed, or even just like, or just hugging their children, even if older children. Show them showing physical care and attention. And I think that can go a long way.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, it's a great question. Usually I'm thinking, generally I approach almost all my characters through empathy in some way. Like, even if they're going to be sort of distasteful characters, I want their emotional sort of responses or lives to feel authentic. But like specific to parents and children, because I find myself thinking about this frequently, like when I'm writing, but also, I don't know, just in life. And like you, Regina, as a high school teacher, like every year we're presented with students. I mean, we're not their parents, but there is that sort of there's the parental authority side of that relationship with the teacher. Anyway, specific to children, and this was, I don't know, a fairly recent discovery for me. It was like, when I think of my parents, they're still like, they're almost stuck, even though like they're much older now, both in their 70s. In a lot of ways, like for me, I have to work sometimes to take them out of like a fixed memory of what my parents were, like the accumulation of who they were when I was a child. It's almost like, wow, the parent doesn't change. Like I still talk to them like, and sometimes like they're the same, like they're those people, but they're not those people anymore. They're different. Time has changed them. And as a parent, it's if you're late, if you know, there's a really easy, you know, / lazy way of like the same thing. You view your kids as the same way. Like you assume your 22-year-old son is gonna be the first person to spill the milk at the counter because he used to spill milk all the time at the table. So like, it's just a natural thing to like, I think on both of those spectrums. So I think there's just a lot of ways to build authentic characters if you leave yourself as the writer when you're creating open to that that really weird two-way time continuum thing of both parents and children being fixed, but they're not fixed. But there's the perception of that being fixed. There's a lot of interesting ways that you can sort of mess with that.
So Errick, one tip that you can give to non-authors who are not parents, who don't occupy a parental, you know, like Paul was saying, teachers do occupy sort of a parental / adult, you know, role model role.
Okay.
Younger people. So what would your advice be, that one piece of advice you would give to authors who don't have any of that experience, but who are also writing, including parents, dads, especially in their fiction?
I think having your characters display the full spectrum of emotions and having honest reactions to them, whether that's an internal dialogue or an external reaction. And, you know, because the toughest thing to do is create a character that has a journey front to back. If they start out great and they end great, then, you know, what happened? But having access, since you're writing the character, you have access to their emotional turmoil and their inner thoughts, and to really explore the various ways that they react to something, whether that's demonstrated outwardly or not.
Yeah. Okay, so here's one thing that we've been all wondering. So, you know, what are your tips and suggestions for speculative fiction authors who write in genres or subgenres such as grim dark fantasy and horror, where violence and violent masculinity is still very much a genre convention? I mean, how can they include more positive father figures and male role models in those kind of stories, in that kind of genre? Marshall?
So I don't write horror, nor do I really write grimdark, but
this is still in your wheelhouse. Get to it.
I'm trying to think. On one level, like, my character who is probably the most violent character is, on some level, I have him be aware that he is the person who should never be a role model, and actively says that, like, you know, like when there's another character that he is somewhat of a father figure to, and as soon as like there's the opportunity for this character to like go somewhere else and not be in his orbit, he's like, go, you need to go to school and do that and not learn more things from me because I am terrible. And I think that's, you know, like, that's the big thing I do there. But I think the other thing ties to what Errick was saying about showing that dimensionality. Even if you have a character for whom, by the necessity of the story or the world that they live in, has to be violent in certain situations, that doesn't have to be their whole personality. That doesn't, you know, they have a spectrum within them and can demonstrate when violence is inappropriate just as much as when it's necessary.
So, Paul, you write in the most violent genre. Here.
Yeah.
So, horror. So.
Yeah, it's fine, you know, because you sent us a lot of these questions before, and like to me, that's been like the hardest one to sort of, you know, to get at for me, honestly. But I would say, like, a little bit jumping on to what, you know, Errick and Marshall were saying earlier, like the idea of, like, even just in terms of, like, in terms of like bad writing, like you don't, like, we're well beyond the point of the mustache, you know, particular to a father, a mustache, you know, twirling villain, right? Like, even if it's going to be someone doing terrible things, I think it's important to give them that emotional spectrum. Otherwise, it's just going to fail the story. as far as the positive role models goes, I mean, I think we've talked the whole time about it. Like, let me go back to like, because it's a hard question to answer. Like, do we, you know, let's, since you brought The Shining, like I want to sort of get back to that. There's the film and obviously the book are quite different in how it treats the main character, or not the main character, or the father, Jack Torrance. You know, in the Kubrick film, you know, he's very much, you know, seems evil from the first frames of the movie, right? There's no, you know, there's no question that as he's portrayed, that he's not a good dude. Whereas in the King novel, I think it much more represents like his fears, Torrance's descent into a slow descent into alcoholism, and the fears he has. And it's a much more rich and nuanced portrayal of someone who's doing terrible things. And when I say you can understand why he's doing it, it's not that you're why he's doing it, but you can sort of see where. So I think sympathy is sort of the key there. I don't know, for me, and even the Kubrick film, I think like you definitely don't sympathize with the Jack Torrance character. Like, I find the film still effective too, because it's like a clear display of, you know, just unleashed, you know, toxic behavior and the effects that it sort of has. So I know with horror, it gets sticky because obviously, you know, I'm writing, you know, we write about bad things. And I think that's why horror can get, you know, can get such a visceral reaction, because horror depends on some sort of transgression, right? And if it goes poorly, man, that's really, you know, memorable to say, to put it nicely. So yeah, it's hard.
Errick?
I'm actually going to do something that I don't think anybody should really do, and I'm going to be self-referential about two things. So there's a story I wrote for the Bad Book that's taking place in like a far-flung post-apocalyptic future where slavery, a form of slavery, has made a comeback. And in writing this particular scene, I remembered, or I was thinking about, so a single mom, a single parent is fulfilling multiple roles. So like a single mom can be fulfilling the role of a father in a lot of ways. But I was also considering that there's a moment in a kid's life where they become aware of the things that a parent is giving up or sacrificing or taking on. Whereas before, you know, there is a moment where they had no idea, but then there's a moment where it's like, oh my God, you know, my parent just gave up a career in X to make sure that I was okay, or did this or did that, and they become aware of that. Like I think that's that type of thing is another good way of introducing a sort of an emotional change or a sort of a turn in a story that can become a formative moment for a character growing up. Both, in fact, like the parent can be aware of the fact that their kid became aware of this, or the kid can be aware of this and become a different person and grow.
So, you know, discussing all this just suddenly brought to mind The Mandalorian, because his profession is so violent. And we see in one episode that, you know, little, you know, Baby Yoda.
Grogu.
Grogu, yes, his name escaped me. So little Grogu, you know, watched his dad shoot people up and, you know, hit people and stuff. And then his reaction to a threat is to be violent. And then Mando realizes, oh, he's actually watching what I do. And then he doesn't tone it down, but it seems like he adjusts his behavior when he's around the kid. So yeah, it's interesting, this whole fatherhood thing, showing how it evolves. And I think all the people who wrote the scripts, the writers, they're all dads as well. I think parents. So it was interesting looking at all of that, how parenting evolved in, you know, for someone in a very violent profession, adjusting his behavior because he has a kid. So speaking of that, so how can speculative fiction authors engage with positive representations of fatherhood and healthy male role models in their stories to address issues like sexism, misogyny, and violence against women without sounding pedantic or preachy. So let's start with Marshall.
That's a question I don't know if I've achieved anything resembling competence or mastery of, but I mean, I'd certainly I don't write anything that has explicit violence against women I have female characters that are in fights, but that's not the same thing. But it's definitely not something how to do better without sounding preachy or pedantic. I don't think I've mastered that yet. So
Paul, how do you handle that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one answer, like, honestly, it really depends on what the story needs, like how you're going to address it. I mean, sometimes it's okay to be pedantic and preachy if that's what the story calls for. And so I know I am going to do what Errick just said we shouldn't do and refer to ourselves, but just because it's the only way I can answer this is, when I wrote A Head Full of Ghosts, which is sort of a postmodern retelling of like the Exorcist, right? And so once I got into it, I wanted to engage with a lot of the bad stereotypes of possession stories, where it's typically a young prepubescent or early teenage girl who's possessed, and there's obviously a lot of misogynistic tones to that. And so instead of tiptoeing around it, I called it out in every way that I could. Like I even had like a blogger comment on, almost like a Greek chorus, commenting on what was going on. And the reason, aside from like, getting to present my views, I suppose, it was also a nice way to actually build the story too, because the story really hinged on ambiguity. So here's someone who's commenting on, something supernatural isn't really going on here. And here's all this evidence because this, what happened here is the typical sort of misogynistic, et cetera, of the church conflating, mental illness in women in particular with signs of possession, et cetera. So that, in that story in particular, I got to sort of engage with it at times pedantically, and hopefully that worked for the reader. Other times, I think it goes back to what I think Errick and both Marshall have been saying in particular, is like when you include characters, you have them have, real emotional lives as much as you can.
Errick?
I don't know. Personally, I find it easier to deal with things that I don't agree with or have strong reactions to, the better I understand them. And I do think that stories are a good way when you're using real life examples and actual data and learning to demonstrate the motivations or thinking behind people that fall into those categories, to better understand where the heck they're coming from and why they do what they do. I think is one of the best ways to head something off or to avoid it. Like, I'm not saying, this comes up a lot, like, oh, we should listen to the Nazis because they're a political party, and it's not quite that. It's mostly understanding what something is in order to deconstruct it or put a stop to it or avoid it. Like, at best, I think that's maybe how that could work.
And working on what three of you said, it put me in mind of Terry Pratchett, and he has written, he has broken the fourth wall or whatever, and he has, entire paragraphs talking about some social ill or another, and it's been very effective. He did it very effectively. And sometimes you wonder, well, is it really that bad to be occasionally pedantic or preachy in your fiction? But yeah, if you're not an expert like Sir Terry, it might get tricky. it
Yeah.
might get dodgy at some point if you try to do that. I guess the key is to make sure that your readers are so invested in your story that they don't mind the occasional aside for a paragraph.
Yeah. I think Pratchett, I'm sorry.
I mean, what do you all think about that, you know?
I think Pratchett was excellent at condensing some of these ideas into a situation that was easy to understand. And comic strips do this, right? In 1, 3, 2, or 4 panels, like in very brief, like, oh, I get it. I get it. I know exactly what they're talking about. And I don't know. I'm talking about this, and I just keep thinking of a comic strip I saw where someone where this serf is saying, like, you know, maybe we could improve society a little. And then a guy, and a guy, some troll pops out of the well, and he's like, and yet you participate in society. And it's like, oh, I get it. That's the kind of, yes, that situation I understand. And Pratchett does that a lot in his books about societal ills or misconceptions. He does it a lot with the death character, you know. So this, yeah, he was excellent at that. And I think comic strips are excellent at doing that sort of thing.
Do you think that the fact that Pratchett was writing comedy, and you know, a lot of comic strips rely on comedy, do you think that is why they can get away with, you know, being slightly more pedantic or preachy without seeming pedantic or preachy?
Yeah, big time. Comedians do it too. They rip something down to like this really little, this quick situation that you totally get.
The jester can tell the king the things no one else can.
Sure. It's a skill of I would really classify him almost as a satirist, right? Like the ability to sort of like brilliantly break that down. So like, I don't know, someone like me, I definitely don't feel like, you know, a pithy, like I can't write a comic strip. Like I like it takes me an entire novel to say what I want to say. Like I can't, in terms of like explaining something, like, and even as a reader, like I'm terrible at remembering names and titles. Like, but what I always forget of any book I've ever read is how I felt, like the emotions that book made me feel. So I don't know. I feel like that's how I work as a writer too. Like, I'm terrible at explaining these things off the cuff. It took me 300 pages to sort of say what I wanted to say, which is, you know, for writers out there, that's a good way of doing it too. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. So final question. What can speculative fiction teach other fiction genres about writing about fathers and fatherhood and good male role models? Marshall?
Keep calling on me first.
Just pretend to freeze again.
Well, you have the misfortune of being right next to me on the screen. And usually go clockwise. So
I mean,
alphabetically, you're first as well. So
I mean, a big thing, I think speculative fiction has the freedom to do like crazier things to be metaphors than anybody else can. Like we can make a whole thing about fathers and sons and weave it into a zombie apocalypse story, or you know, or a space opera story, and use that as the way to make it more fun. I mean, I think I'm going to bring up Fonda Lee again, but she just tweeted yesterday that the great thing about speculative fiction is we can take any other story and then make it cooler by adding. and to a degree, I think that's what we can do when talking about fatherhood and father-children relationships. Is speculative fiction can add new dimensions to it by the nature of the genre.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard one. I mean, I think I'd be a little bit of a hypocrite if I said, you know, there's something innate to genre that allows us to do something better than literary fiction, for example. But I mean, literary fiction is a genre, you know, particularly because, you know, there is still that stigma. It's gotten much better, but, you know, I went to a reading a few weeks ago where a couple of literary authors were sort of, you know, said some things that were very sort of anti-genre. I was like, oh, really? That's still a thing, huh? Yeah. So, I mean,
Snobs, man.
Yeah, even though
Snobs.
I mean I don't write science fiction, I think maybe one part of the obvious answer would be, science fiction clearly gets to look forward, gets to try to forecast, not only what's going to be, societally, socially, etc. I don't know. Like I would play it the other way. Like as a genre fiction writer, don't be afraid to go to other genres to see, there are great examples there. Like I wrote down a few books because I do read literary fiction from time to time. One of my favorite books is a memoir and it's one of the best titles ever. Another Bullshit Night in Suck City by Nick Flynn, who's a poet. But it's a memoir, and it's about how he was when he was volunteering at a homeless shelter in Boston, the Pine Street Inn. That's where he met his father, or re-met his father after having not seen him for a bunch of years. So in terms of like a story about fatherhood, that memoir rings in my head. That was something I probably read like 10 or 15 years ago. So, and that story or the memoir, like what he does with it, like in terms of jumping around time frame, I mean, it feels genre-y or speculative, I should say, in a way, just based on how it's structured. So I don't know. I think, just write good genre pieces. I mean, like when I say good, like, make the characters real, make them authentic, emotionally authentic.
Eric.
Yeah, I think Marshall's correct. And Fondly, I saw that tweet as well. And like, it's spot on. Like, because you can take, and Paul's right. And I'm totally reluctant to admit this, but Paul is also right. In terms of what makes it interesting is if you take as fully formed a character as possible and you can put them into the most insane situations. Like you can have anything goes. And in the context of anything goes, it can be a romance, which to me is just far more interesting than people bumbling through real life, because that's what I have every day, all the time. I have that all the time. It's not entertaining. This is entertainment.
Sometimes it's entertaining, Eric. Sometimes real life is. Well,
That sounds like a curse. That's a curse.
I mean, no. What was it that I keep hearing this? When you see a new, the Onion shares a new satirical thing, and everybody goes, "Wait, that's satire." But right now, reality is a lot more wild than whatever the Onion can come up with.
It's far too interesting. But again, that's a curse. May your life be interesting. It's like,
Yeah, I'm of Chinese heritage. I really veto that saying in Chinese. I'm like, no, that is like the worst curse ever. Stick on someone. So we've come to the end of the discussion, everyone. Oh, Anusha has stuck Fonda's tweet in the chat box on YouTube for everyone to go see. There's a response from Misty, who asked you all the questions. She says, "Thank you for answering my question. Ironically, all of the books mentioned are on my to-be-read pile, and they've just got bumped up on it." And Anusha, the producer, said, "Some of them just made it to my to-be-read list. So many books, so little time." All right, so we are going to wrap up. So before we do that, here are a few resources that y'all who are watching this can use. Now, if you want to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, please visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Please note that we do have a lot of sort of 101 primers about different types of violence against women, everything from domestic violence to missing and murdered Indigenous women, and we are adding more all the time. So go there if you're not sure what is what. Go there to have a look, and especially have a look at domestic violence, please, because lately we've had a lot of high-profile cases, including Depp versus Heard. No, we are not going to get on that because we will never leave this. We will never leave this panel session if we start discussing Depp versus Heard. But please do have a look, learn more about domestic violence. I'm going to say this. We're going to have a panel coming soon, and watch out for the announcement on Facebook, on our Facebook page. And also to find out more about the Fathers for Pixels program that this panel is part of, please visit http://bit.ly dads for pixels. So dads for pixels, that's case sensitive. So capital letter D, dads, 4 is the number 4, pixels start with a capital letter P. And I'm going to share a little slide right now for everyone because we have something special if you haven't heard about it. All right. So pardon my cold. So we have released our first charity anthology last September, and Errick's on it. Errick has a story in it, and Paul has reviewed it. So we had a special edition on 1st September 2021, and that has been replaced, at least for the paperback, it has been replaced with the classic edition. This is the new book cover, the classic edition of Giving the Devil His Due, and it's all about revenge. And I'm sorry to say, or happy to say, or I can't decide. There are lots of bad dads in that because it's all about male violence against women and violent men getting their comeuppance in some very interesting ways. There's like a whole, we just let 16 speculative fiction authors loose, and Paul can attest to the variety of ways that violent and bad male role models get their comeuppance. And it's available now from Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and all other major booksellers worldwide. And for more information about it, visit bit.ly/giving the devil his due. This is case sensitive, so please take that down. And Anusha is going to put the link. She's put the link in the YouTube chat box. And if you need more, and if you want to score a special Giving the Devil His Due book plate, please also go visit that page. There's a link there. Just click on the button. You can go to the page about free book plates. And all net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. So I'm going to stop sharing now because Paul has an announcement. And it's not the announcement that you think it is, everybody. But he does have an announcement. So what's your announcement, Paul?
Now I feel self-conscious. Oh, no, I was just going to mention that I have a new book coming out July 5th called The Pallbearers Club. That's it.
Okay. So you're not going to say what it's about? You're just going to tell everyone to go get it?
It's presented as like a found memoir, very much sort of like it could have been an alternate universe path that I might have taken, except I named the character Art Barbara instead of Paul Tremblay. Because Art Barbara in a Boston accent is very funny. Art Barbara. In the late 80s, he starts a pallbearers club, which he volunteers at local funeral homes to serve elderly and homeless who don't have any living relatives. But then a strange woman joins the club, and she may or may not be a supernatural being from New England folklore. So I guess we'll leave it at there. And they have like a 3 decades long relationship, or friendship, I should say, or frenemyship.
Okay.
Anyway.
Frenemyship. That's a new portmanteau word.
Yeah.
So Marshall and Errick, do you have anything coming up in the next 3 months? Any events that you're going to be at that people can go meet you or sit in on other discussions? Anything?
I will be at ArmadilloCon, which is August 5th through 7th here in Austin, in which Fonda Lee is one of our special guests. And I will be at Worldcon in Chicago in September. That sounds right, yes. So
Errick,
those are my big appearances this year.
Okay, Errick, are you doing anything? Any other panels? Anything else coming in the next 3 months?
The only convention I'll be attending the rest of this year is probably Nikon. I am working on the 3rd novel in the Alexander Smith trilogy. That'll be The Headless Woman. And I'm also going to be doing an appearance with Mike Squatrito at Narragansett Brewery at the end of this month. That's going to be plastered all over my social media and Mike's, as well as should appear on the brewery's page. And yeah, I think that's about it. I've been doing a lot of graphic design for some reason, like book design, interior, and covers, and none of which I can talk about because none of it's been published yet.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end of the panel. So everyone, please, thank you for being with us for the last 90 minutes while we talk about dads and fathers and fatherhood and male role models. It's Father's Day weekend, so if you have a great relationship with your dad, remember to give him a hug, give him a call. If you don't have a great relationship with your dad, we understand. We all understand here on the panel. So have a really good evening or morning or afternoon if you're in Australia or New Zealand or wherever you are in the world. We'll see you at our next live panel session, which is next July. And again, please follow the Pixel Project on Facebook and Twitter. We make lots of announcements about events like this. Good night, everybody.